This is video 2 of your Chapter 11 PR lecture. Welcome back, fashion promoters. In this video, we are going to first start talking about how does a PR department create relationships and these unpaid media exposure opportunities. So, it's one thing to say all of this, but, what are these, how it might be a little bit trickier to kind of wrap your mind around how this happens. So your textbook section calls this public relations tools, but I wanted to just pull that apart a little bit. I find that some of the language they've used in here is a little bit close. So in this case, this is really about exactly how they do it. What are the steps? So first off, the public relations process. It's a 4-step process, but you can kind of drop into any of these steps at any given time. So the first step is research. So we're going to do research on the people we're trying to reach, the media outlets we want to focus on, how our brand is already perceived by the media so that we can make sure to cast a positive light on our brand and to continue to enhance our reputation. So the next step is once we learn all that information, and it could just be as simple, like the research could be as simple as looking through social media feeds and seeing our hashtags. If we've got all kinds of negative hashtags, then that's a bad thing, right? People were using some pretty bad hashtags about hashtag I'm no angel for the Victoria's Secret example. That seems to be my go-to example for this lecture. Whereas, for Fenty, it was all positive hashtags. So then you're going to plan. So, okay, now that we have this information, what are we going to do to either enhance our reputation or to improve it? So in the case of Fenty, this meant continuing on their course, right? They've been doing real well. So they're going to start to plan for the upcoming shows or what the next lines are, what their next big moves are, what type of celebrities they're going to dress or where they're going to place their product. And what kind of fashion magazines are they going to send samples to for photographing, that kind of thing. Then they're going to communicate. So this is when they start doing things like releasing press releases, which we'll talk about soon, or placing their products in certain magazines or movies or certain different formats. Maybe trying out new technologies, trying out new different types of advertising. So, they're going to do the research first. Usually they're going to do their planning for their upcoming push, and then they're going to communicate and try to enhance their long-term relationships. And then they're going to evaluate the success or failure of their efforts. So we'll talk a little bit more about that very soon and how they do that. But one of the ways is just simply looking at how they're being mentioned or who's mentioning them or what hashtags are being used, that kind of thing. And then we start the process all over again. We're going to continue researching, so looking at how the brand is mentioned. We're going to keep planning and strategizing for the future. How can we make this better or continue to improve? And then we're going to communicate. So we're going to act on what we learned while researching, and then we're going to evaluate that success and start all over again. So all 4 of these processes are really happening kind of simultaneously. And you might think about this in your own, in something that you can already relate to. So let's say it's you're an influencer of your own, right? So you're going to be researching what's the next thing you want to do. And maybe that research is just like putting together new cool outfits or whatever. And then you're going to look at how people are responding to the way you're promoting yourself online. And then you're going to plan for the future, like, oh, people really like it when I wear this brand. Maybe I'll wear more of that brand. Or people really like it when I do outfit of the day posts, so I'm going to keep doing that. They don't like it so much when I communicate, when I repost stuff, so maybe I'll stop doing that. And that's when you're going to communicate. So now that you've planned to do more of those things and less of the other things, you're going to do that. You're going to do that, right? You're going to start making those posts, and then you're going to evaluate. So you'll, again, look at the number of likes and mentions and reposts you get. which is similar to your research, right? So these two are quite similar, these two things. You kind of do them at the same time. Evaluate whether or not something was successful, research what you're going to do next, and plan for what you're going to do in the future. So these can happen really in any order. So then I want to also make sure to note that the values of the brand are really important. So when you're thinking about how to communicate your values, you really have to be reflective of what those values are and what you stand for as a company. So, I'm just going to keep coming back to this example that I've been using. The Victoria's Secret, the value that they wanted to stand behind was the creation of a fantasy and upholding this ideal beauty, right? This ideal woman that would walk down the runway wearing their bras and panties and angel wings. So that was really important to the brand, was this fantasy and creating this alternate universe almost that people could live in, even if it was just for a moment while they watched the show or while they wore those underwear. And I would say that having had experience with the Victoria's Secret catalog in the 90s, coming to my house, because my mom was a dedicated customer through that time when she was a younger woman, I would say that brand has always been about creating that fantasy. They would have these crazy sets in, beautiful old buildings with pillars and art on the walls, and these women kind of in these scenarios that just seem very unrealistic, like, that pose can't be comfortable to just be hanging out on the couch, like, no way. So they would create these fantasies, whereas the values of a brand like Fenty has always been inclusivity. For example, the Fenty makeup line having their extended range of shades for women that have typically, or women or men or non-binary folks, being typically left out of the fashion makeup realm, and often having to mix their own makeup shades, or basically just kind of go without a shade that really matched their skin tone. So they represented that in the product, and then that carried on to their runway communications. They had different abilities represented on the runways, many different skin tones or sizes. There was even the one young lady who was pregnant and had her baby shortly after the show finished that night. So all of those different types of representation were all very important to the values of the brand, and that was what they chose to use in their communications. Their social media reflects that as well. So how does a PR department communicate? So, I've been talking about this communications. How does this happen? And your textbook goes through lots of different ways. And there are other ways as well, but these are some main buckets you could think about, or categories. So your textbook calls them the public relations tools. So first off, there's internal relations. So this is within that brand, so within that company. And it's about creating a positive corporate culture so that employees feel motivated. This is really about working with the human resources department. So for example, let's say that you were just entering the job market and you are a young woman. Maybe you're a young woman of color that is hoping to get a position, but what you've heard about the brand is that they tend to be rather discriminatory in their practice, and that maybe there's a culture of sexual abuse happening or sexual harassment happening. You're probably not going to want to apply to that company, right? And if you work for that company, you're probably not going to want to continue working for them if you're subjected to that kind of abuse. And so that's an example of how PR departments are thinking about public internal relations and internal functioning of their company and their corporate culture. You're also going to be thinking about investor relations. So investors are people that give your brand money to keep it afloat. They get returns on their investment in the form of dividends, so payouts every year, or when they sell their stocks. So the people in PR want to keep these shareholders or these investors pretty happy, right? They want to keep that money coming in. And so investor relations is a pretty important function of PR companies as well, to keep the money flowing. It's vital. So issues management, so this is where that more reactive thing comes in of like damage control. Okay, so we've committed this sin, we've committed this problem, now how do we fix it? So this is, again, just one small piece of the PR puzzle. I know people seem to zero in on it, but this is just one small little piece of this whole thing, just one little piece of this Venn diagram here. And so it's really about, you know, if we do something wrong, what do we do? So for example, Fenty named their eyeliner, the Geisha eyeliner, I think it was, and they got into a lot of problems with public outcry being like, oh, well, you're all about inclusivity, but using the word geisha has a whole cultural connotation that, you know, you can't really use. It's not yours to use, and it's, you know, being used in a disrespectful way to the culture that the cultural context around the geisha. And so, you know, in issues management, Fenty apologized and changed the name, right? They took the product off the shelf, changed the name, and relaunched. So that is one function of PR, and that's a pretty good example. Lobbying. So this is about government, relationships with government. So you want to influence legislation, so laws and government regulations to suit your needs. So for example, if you used polyester and suddenly the government has decided that polyester is really bad for the environment and you can't use it anymore, that's going to be pretty bad for your brand. So lobbyists would then go and meet with politicians and say like, hey, you can't do this. Like, this is going to put our brand out of business. So that's the type of thing that lobbyists do. There's lobbyists in all kinds of industries. They're much more spoken about in industries outside of fashion, but we've got them too. Then you've got media relations. So this is the development of professional relationships with people that might write about you or cover you in other types of news media. So this is, you know, I joke about the PR person who gets to go take people to lunch and have cocktails over lunch. That's what happens here. This is about interacting with the media, or maybe you're pulling samples and outfits and sending it to Vogue to be shot in their next editorial. That all falls under this media relations bubble. Public affairs. So this is when we work with customers or government agencies to represent the fashion brand to this greater public and maintain a positive image. So it's, you know, it sounds pretty similar, and it is fairly similar to these other things like lobbying and media relations in some ways, and issues management. It is just another way that things are really managed, and careful presentation of the brand to the media. Then you have events and sponsorships. I'm sure you're pretty familiar with these. So these are things like fashion shows or press events, or, you know, holding special parties. For example, we'll talk about one with Fashion Cares and Nova, Fashion Nova and Fashion Nova Cares event coming up in the next video. But different types of events and sponsorships can certainly play into how we perceive the brand. Let's say, for example, a company was making masks for the coronavirus right now. You know, that's going to be a special event that makes us think about them pretty positively. Like if they held an event where people got together and did that, I mean. So then you have publicity. So this is, publicity is any communication that really tries to tell others about a product, service, idea, that kind of thing. This is, again, information that is disseminated through the media. None of this can be disseminated from the brand, or it's just called advertising. So these are all, again, I will note, unpaid types of coverage from the media, an outside third party. These cannot come from the brand the way that they're mentioned, you know, with the exception maybe of like the fact that the company itself, the fashion brand, is the one that is trying to get these things covered. But let's say, for example, you decide you're going to have this media event, but nobody comes. That, you know, you can't control that. So it's about how that event is covered. So I'm going to stop this video there, and when we come back, we will talk about all of the different formats that PR takes. So where can we really see PR in action?